one of the really memorable moments was back in, it was 1961, that our congregation got an invitation from a white congregation in Tuscaloosa that inviting our youth to come and spend a Sunday evening with their youth to just, get to know each other and talk to each other across the racial lines, something that just never happened in those days. And when I brought this invitation to the youth at St. Paul, and I asked, are there any youth who would like to go with me to this youth group, white youth group in Tuscaloosa on a Sunday evening? And there were two 15-year-old girls who said that they were very interested in going, and Carolyn Freeman, the young woman I was describing, was one of them, and the other was Betty Wells. And we went, had a great evening, and on Wednesday of that week that we were there, there was the article in the Birmingham paper that told the story of a pastor, the young pastor of this white congregation in Tuscaloosa, having been picked up by the Ku Klux Klan, taken out to the edge of Tuscaloosa, beaten, and left to walk back to Tuscaloosa on the railroad tracks at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then I got a phone call that very morning as I was reading the paper and learning about this awful thing that happened at the hands of the KKK, and I got a rough voice on the other end that said, well, you and the two girls are next. Click. And when I went to tell the parents and the girls that, we had this threat, I felt that I had to tell them about this because, after all, after what happened to the pastor in Tuscaloosa, you couldn't pass this off as inconsequential. And so as I went to each of them, I remember that in my conversation with Carolyn Freeman, after I told her about the threat, I asked her whether she was afraid, and she answered, and this still is amazing to me, 55 years later, that she said, no, I'm not so much afraid as I am ashamed. And I said, well, what do you mean you're ashamed, Carolyn? And she said, well, others have suffered so much and done so much for the freedom of my people and all people, and I have done so little. That faith and that understanding of life and of her own calling is just remarkable for a 15-year-old girl. But it's also a reminder of how ever since the Montgomery bus boycott and the development of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Civil Rights Movement, there was a growing sense of the freedom movement, and I'm sure, was partially caught up in that, but I think also just caught up in her own Christian faith that recognized that I need to be active and involved in doing something for, as she put it, the freedom of her people and all people. So that's a little vignette from the 1960s that is unforgettable for me, and I've told that story in various cases? It was individuals who participated. We didn't have any movements, any movement meetings at St. Paul, and we did not, as a congregation, participate in the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, Reverend Shuttlesworth's organization, but definitely supported it, and I served on the Central Committee, is what it was called, during the '63 demonstrations, and this was the committee that had several people from the community. Jeannie Drew, for one, I recall, but this is the committee that met with Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, and the SCLC staff in Birmingham at the time of the demonstrations, and definitely had an opportunity to weigh in on plans for the next 2 or 3 days. I didn't have any great sway or word in those meetings. That was a time when I was learning and growing, and just honored to be invited to be a part of that committee.